Hello, welcome to the Theology Pugcast. It's great to have you here for this special episode. We are here in Nashville, Tennessee at the Thank God for Bitcoin conference. And Glenn and I were brought in because we're such authorities on the subject of Bitcoin to speak.
How do you spell that?
Yeah, that's right. So it's been fun. You know, this was actually my second round. I was at the Thank God for Bitcoin conference in Miami, and I enjoyed that. And I got kind of the Bitcoin bug a little bit down there, and it's really great to have Glenn here because Glenn will get the bug too, and the next thing you know, he'll be walking around with orange T-shirts on, and and all that kind of stuff. But we're joined by Jordan Bush, who is
the executive director of TGFB Media.
Okay. Yeah. So tell us a little bit about how you got into that. Now, you were involved in missions.
Yep. Yeah, so again, the Cliff Notes version is my wife and I got married knowing that we wanted to be missionaries. We had met in Bible college and, basically heard about the need for the gospel to be preached all over the world and that there were thousands of languages that still had no scripture translated into them. And so we separately at that point just decided and surrendered our lives to be missionaries. And so then got married, started raising support to join a church planting team in Montevideo, Uruguay. Again, we had initially thought jungle tribe, and then once we had a 1-year-old, we were wondering about the prudence of bringing a 1-year-old into the jungle. So we ended up joining a team that was going to an urban jungle and went to Uruguay. And so the expectation that we had was that we were going to minister in an urban context, downtown, middle upper class, demographics, and Uruguay is a very secular place. It's one of the two most secular countries in Latin America. About 50% of Uruguay claims to be Roman Catholic, but only about 5% practice. And then out of the other 50%, about 40+% would identify as either atheist or agnostic. And so we were preparing. I was a philosophy major. My wife was a Derrida and Foucault, studied those guys. And it was a Christian, studying those in a public university. And so we ended up just thinking that we were going to, be in this very secular place, and at that time thinking, we're going to be like the Uruguayan, the Tim Keller ministering like, in these contexts. Right. And so then once we actually got there, we planted the church, and much to our surprise, half of our church members ended up being Venezuelan immigrants. Huh. And so we just began to ask them, and just why are 60,000 Venezuelans flooding into Uruguay? And so the more that we just started to, again, we're doing counseling and just trying to help them with basic food supplies and, basic furniture and stuff. Yeah. We just started to learn just what had happened to result in their currency failing. So
so basically currency failure is kind of the occasion for you to learn about Bitcoin. Was that okay?
Yeah. So we just basically found out that, some of these people who showed up in Uruguay, many of them were men. And what would be called military age men. We could talk about that later. But we had these men who were coming, and they left their families to try to come and get a job, and then be able to save enough money to send some home and then save up to bring their family to Uruguay. And so some of these guys were doctors, economists. It was like an indictment on their economic career in some way. Just people who were making, in some cases, 6 figures in dollar terms a few years prior. Right. And a few years later, flash forward, they can't even pay the rent in Uruguay of a few $100s a month. Yeah. And so again, we just, for 4 years, there was no like in-depth study on my part. It just was observational, of just what it looks like when a currency fails. Right. So you had, again, the government makes promises to get elected. They promise free stuff. Right. And then they print money to pay for the free stuff.
Yeah, I've noticed that gets votes. Yeah. You promise free stuff and people vote for you.
Yep.
So you have a collapse and you learn about Bitcoin. And how does Bitcoin address that? I think for a lot of our listeners out there, this is exotic stuff. This is high tech, weird, kind of subject matter. But how does Bitcoin, this sort of virtual money, I guess what people would say, solve that kind of problem?
Yeah, so again, the thing that was interesting to me was, so flash forward 4 years after we arrive in Uruguay, I'm a missionary. I'm trying to figure out, I'm like, hey, I haven't even looked at our missionary equivalent or nonprofit equivalent of a 401k in 4 years. It was awful, reprehensible, dereliction of my responsibility. But I just didn't know anything about it.
Yeah.
And so I started to try to understand the investment world a little bit. And as part of that thing, I'm sitting there looking at the investing landscape, and I'm thinking to myself, well, the one thing I know about investing is that you're supposed to buy low and sell high. And as I'm examining these things, I'm like, stocks are at all-time highs. Real estate's at all-time highs. No one equipped me for what to do when everything is at all-time highs. And so I just gave a cursory glance at Bitcoin. And then, again, the philosophy major in me was just trying to understand, okay, I see this thing moving up and down, the dollar-denominated price, but like, what actually is this thing? And the point that really was impactful to me was realizing that it was its origin story. So it was created in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis to be a money that a government couldn't just devalue. The creator talked about the fact that it was unjust that the United States government had bailed out these profligate gambling banks. None of them went to jail, but all the normal people lost their homes.
It's quite a contrast to Iceland.
Yes.
My understanding is in Iceland they did send the bankers to jail.
Some of them, I believe it,
So you have this economic sort of kind of nut house here in the United States. You have another nut house situation down in Venezuela. But how does Bitcoin address that? We haven't got to the what is
to the meat and potatoes. So it's a digital currency that has a fixed limit. There's a fixed number. So there will only ever be 21 million Bitcoin. And so basically, and it's a lot of questions around, well, how do you guarantee that there's that? And it has to do with the way that Bitcoin is designed. And basically, if someone were to try to change that, there's a number of mechanisms in place that prevent that from actually happening.
So let's stop a minute and just kind of drill down a little bit. So inflation is something that we're familiar with because people hear about it and then they can see the effects. But I don't think a lot of folks really understand, sort of the cause and effect dynamic. So inflation is basically an increase in the money supply. When the underlying assets have not necessarily kept up.
So then
people think of inflation as the prices are inflating.
Yeah.
But you really hit the core of it. It's the money supply is inflating, which causes the prices to go up.
Right.
Because you have more money chasing the same or fewer goods. Therefore, prices go up.
And it's in the government's interest to do this because their own debts get paid against the sort of the original amount of money that had been borrowed. So they print more money to pay the debts so basically their debt service or their debt load is kind of lessened for that reason.
Now, before we move on, there's a moral issue at work here.
Absolutely.
And the scripture over the conference, everybody seems to be talking about the scriptural teaching on equal weights and measures. Over and over again, Scripture, God says how much He hates unjust weights, unjust measures. And what happens when the government, actually the U.S. government has a policy that we want to hit 2% inflation. As if that's a good thing. What that means then is your money is progressively losing its value. You are no longer, the government actually has a policy of unequal measures. And so this is a fundamentally moral issue here.
Oh, we can think about that just in relationship to the virtue of thrift. So, for example, saving in an inflationary environment does not make sense. That's a loser strategy. So what are you creating in an environment like that? You're either creating profligate spenders or you're creating speculative investors. You're not creating a scenario where people are thinking in the long term, thinking about self-control, that kind of stuff.
The other thing that I've found, again, I just didn't even mention this in the talk that I gave that kind of talked about this, is one of the effects is that it marginalizes Scripture. So the Scripture, the New Testament is replete with examples of where it says, "Owe no man anything." It talks about and then in the Old Testament it talks about the danger of that, the borrower is slave to the lender. These things where, again, otherwise people who would otherwise be, they would take, they're like, we take the Scripture very seriously. There's just very overt examples and very plainly stated about the importance of avoiding debt. But in an inflationary environment like this, you basically, debt is just second nature to us now. And so then what is one of the natural consequences of this? Then it's natural to think, well, the Bible's just being cute. That's not how the real world works.
Right.
When in reality, if you look at the broader, the history, like if you look at the history of the world, we are the outliers.
Right.
And so that's another effect, is just like you're marginalizing the Word of God. You're tempting everyday people to have less confidence in the authority and inspiration of Scripture, in terms of being descriptive of how the world actually works.
Right. Now, if you use the opportunities to secure real assets, you can find yourself in a good position through debt.
You're willing to assume the danger, right, in order to get the benefit. And in this kind of environment, it's difficult to not do that.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, because basically, like I noted, savings becomes kind of a loser's game.
Yeah.
So, for example, I'll give you this practical, an anecdote that's practical in character. So, my second son and I were out looking at a house. He's already an owner. He's got his own home, but family's growing, and I saw something that I thought he might be interested in because of the nature of the property. So my old mentor in Connecticut took us to take a look at it. So he's kind of the kingpin of real estate in central Connecticut, that part of Connecticut. And in the course of our conversation following looking at the property, my son said, well, I'm not quite ready. I want to put some more money aside. And this old mentor of mine said, no, that's dumb.
Yeah.
That's not really the way that you need to think in this regard.
It's true.
What you really need to do is get into the property and then let the property inflate, and then that becomes your savings account.
Yep. And that's how that's literally how the system is designed to work.
Right.
And so what that does is, so people who already hold scarce assets, so like real estate, again, so assets that can't be created as quickly as the money itself, end up increasing in nominal terms in value. They end up increasing in value much, just very quickly relative to the other things. So,
but if we had sound money, there would be a whole different approach.
So sound money is deflationary, and so we've been Stockholm syndromed into thinking that deflationary money is like the devil, when in reality, much of Europe was built on scarce, deflationary money standards. Like a lot of the patronage models they're possible within, or they're even more possible within a scarce money standard. And so I think that, we just have been, we've take the last 100 years and act like that's like representative of all time, and we can't fathom, obviously there would be trade-offs involved. But again, there's the question, and this is kind of what we've talked about at the conference, is there's moral principles involved. There's moral character to these decisions. It's not just simply an either or, open, you choose what you want, I do what I want. There's actually real material consequence behind which system you submit to.
So let's think about the nuts and bolts of the Bitcoin, sort of money supply kind of. So you said there's a fixed amount.
21 million Bitcoin.
But not everybody has it yet.
Yes. So
there's a thing called mining, Bitcoin
correct.
mining. How does that all work?
Yeah. So again, it's a whole complicated thing. But basically,
what people would think of mining. Yeah, I get my pick and I go out in the hills and I'm looking for gold.
Yes, exactly. Right. And it actually is a helpful. Again, even if it's not actually descriptive of what's happening, it actually is a helpful thing to think about. So again, throughout much of history, where you've had scarce money, which is there's scarce something being used as money that's scarce. Basically, there was a production cost to money. So if I'm going to use gold and silver, for a long time it was gold or silver by weight that was used. It didn't even necessarily have a mark on it. They measured the weight of it, and so there was a production cost to it. So you have to pay people to give them and pay for the tools that they're using to dig it up out of the ground or blow it up out of the ground or whatever. Pay them for while they're panning it or whatever. Then you have to pay to purify it and then turn it into some sort of thing. So there's time cost, there's a resource cost to the production of coins. And so if if an entity, a governmental entity, wanted to create more of it, they had to first invest the time and resources to make that happen. And so they would do work, and then they would have a product in the end. And so versus the way that the system works now, and this is analogous to how Bitcoin works as well. So there's only two ways to get Bitcoin. One is either to buy these specialized mining computers, pay for a place to store them, pay for people to service them, pay for the energy to power them, and then basically they mine Bitcoin. Right. Or you buy Bitcoin from somebody who's already done that process. So there's a fixed production cost to Bitcoin in the same way that there's a fixed production cost to gold.
So that's how I acquire Bitcoin. I'm the secondary market.
Yep.
I'm the guy that comes along and buys it from other people.
Yes.
Now, who's this?
Hold on.
Sure.
How do you mine it?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
What is going on with mining?
Yes.
There are 21 million of them
Correct.
that are already in existence.
Yes, 21 million in existence, and basically every day, every hour, there are new blocks every 10 minutes, there are new blocks of Bitcoin that effectively they're called mined. So every computer, every specialized Bitcoin mining computer on Earth is all at the same time trying to guess this really long number that will be the number to unlock a certain amount of Bitcoin and send that amount of Bitcoin to their wallet. And so if you're it's like kind of like a lottery, but everyone is guessing at the same time. All of this computational power is trying to do this. And so a new block is found every 10 minutes. So like I said, there are 21 million Bitcoin in existence, and a new block every 10 minutes of a block basically has an amount of Bitcoin within it. And every 10 minutes, a new block containing a specific amount of Bitcoin gets released. So at this point today, 15 years after Bitcoin was initially released, there are over 19 million of the 21 million Bitcoin have already been mined. They're already out in the wild and can be bought and sold and whatever. And there's about 1.5 million, just short of 2 million, that are still out there to be mined. And so this is actually, you could go a number of different ways with this, but this is one of the reasons why concerns about, Bitcoin being able to be co-opted by, governmental entities and stuff like that. The reality is most of the Bitcoin is already out in the world, and it was bought and mined by people who were largely, I say this lovingly, nerds, who were buying this when Bitcoin had very little or really no monetary value initially. Right. It was this cute thing, or there were people who were what's it called, philosophically pure, who really liked the project and took interest in it.
So they were early adopters, and they've enjoyed the benefits of that.
Yes, exactly.
Right,
yep.
Right. Now, when it comes to Bitcoin and what you can do with it, I guess that's another thing to think about.
Yep.
Now, I am aware, because of certain apps that you can have on your phone, that I can actually go grocery shopping or go to a restaurant and use Bitcoin in the area I live.
Yep.
I think many people wonder, what's the use of this stuff? If I've got it, can I ever use it? Or is it just like a bank account and it's valuable, but there's nothing that you can do?
Yeah. And so what I would say, so again, this is where I'm going to give an analogy that I've found to be helpful. But basically, Bitcoin's value in the use cases for it depend on who you are, where you are, when you are, those kind of things. So, for example, there are people in Venezuela today, very difficult still to this day financial situation, who they have their currency. In some cases, they're experiencing 100% daily inflation. So they'll go to the store and find eggs, for example, I'm making this up, but eggs that will be $4 a dozen, and then you come back in the afternoon and they're $8 a dozen.
Yeah.
And so for them, when they look at, when they think about Bitcoin, even though Americans look at Bitcoin, and for us, Bitcoin is very volatile relative to the dollar, relative to the Bolivar, the Venezuelan currency, Bitcoin is actually way less volatile than what they're experiencing. And so for them, it makes sense for them to use Bitcoin. Right. And and there's a growing market of people who are willing to adopt Bitcoin and other things like it, because it even though it's volatile relative to us, it's way less volatile for them, and they can still send it across the world. They can send it.
Well, that's an interesting thing I'd like to get into. But before we do, I want to think a little bit about the fact that human beings, we have a kind of deference to, or I guess preference for, that's a better word, something that's tangible, something I can pick up and touch, and and store, under my bed.
Yep.
Bitcoin, you're like, what?
Yes.
What do I do with, and I can't touch it. It's a number on my phone or.
Yep.
Can you respond to that?
Yeah. So again, and I would say like all of these things and all of these different things, there's trade-offs. There's no such, there is good and evil, obviously, but in terms of there's use cases. And so depending on the threat models that you're facing, there's things that there's threat models in which something being physical is good. Mm-hmm. There's threat models in which something being physical is bad. And so here, I'll give you an example. So a lot of our Venezuelan brothers and sisters, they left Venezuela on foot and they walked across the border into Colombia. And so when they did that, they had a backpack, maybe a suitcase, but you have two things working against you. Number one, you have soldiers who are guarding the borders who sadly are going to have the temptation to abuse their authority.
Sure. Confiscate your material. There,
exactly. Right? Or say, hey, you need to pay me if I'm going to let you out. So if you have a physical good, then you have basically the possibility that either just thieves or government approved thieves can take that from you. With something like Bitcoin, I'm sure this actually has been used in this way in Venezuela. I know in other places it has been used this way. The virtue of Bitcoin, its lack of having something tangible is actually a feature in situations like that. Right. So with Bitcoin, you can move your Bitcoin funds with so you have what's called a public-private key pair. And so public key is just like think a username. Private key is a password. You can memorize a 12 or 24 word seed phrase, 12 words. You can circle them in a book or memorize them in your head. I can cross any border in the world. Get to where I'm going if I'm an immigrant. I can get to where I'm going. I can get an application, like any Bitcoin wallet, input those 12 seed words, and now I have access to my money. I can start over again.
So this reminds me of the Knights Templar and the kind of the banking system they developed for pilgrims going to the Holy Land. You don't want to actually carry all of your goods. You don't want to carry your gold, your silver through territory that might be filled with bandits. So you put it on deposit with one house. You get some documentation, and then you go to another house of the Knights Templar in a different city, and then you get the goods that they have secured for you at the last house. So that's kind of an early rudimentary kind of banking system that developed into what we have today.
And again, that's useful. And so I'm not gonna say like that's awful or something. No, it was useful given the other options. Compared to all the other options, that's a fantastic option. In the Bitcoin white paper, so like the Bitcoin Declaration of Independence, this figure Satoshi Nakamoto, we still don't know who this is.
Well, this is fun because I'd like to get into sats. So there are all kinds of things we can get into here. But go ahead.
So this is one of the things that he says in this white paper, which is basically like a declaration of what the project is and why he did it and stuff, he basically says the problem with the existing monetary system is all the trust that's required to make it work.
Yes, right.
And so again, some of this is just it's a time-bound, problems. I mean, just given the different technology that was available, like this was revolutionary in its time, but over time, again, so here's an example. So Bitcoin is an open ledger. So you can see.
Well, this is an interesting thing about it because I think this was something that was a revelation to me, at the last Bitcoin conference. Go ahead.
So basically every transaction that has ever taken place on the Bitcoin ledger, anybody who wants to can download a copy of this ledger that is continuing to update every 10 minutes.
Yeah, if you want some good material to read before going to bed, and you want to put you out, that would probably be it, right?
Exactly. And so what you do, so what is the...
So you get the entire ledger of the entire history of Bitcoin.
Correct.
So it's like an accounting statement.
Exactly.
This is where all the money is. This is the parties that have it. Now, you're not actually getting names.
Yeah, you're not getting names or anything like that. So what's the equivalent to that in our existing banking system? Well, we have private ledgers. So, and those ledgers are held by banking institutions.
Sure.
So if I went to Wells Fargo and said, "Hey, Wells Fargo, open up your books to me, and I want you to be able to prove that you have the money that you say you have," they're going to be like, "No, kick rocks." Like they're not going to do it. So with Bitcoin, again, you do have a trade-off in terms of, at least on the base layer, which is another conversation we can have. Right. But there's on the base layer, it's in public, completely public. You can see all of the books are open.
Right.
And so that basically, you sacrifice some privacy, but you basically have the certainty. I can see every transaction that has ever taken place, and they continue to add transactions.
Right.
That all the transactions that have occurred in the last 10 minutes, they include.
Yeah. So this implies obviously that we have to have the computing power to make this work, and this is something that makes Bitcoin dependent on obviously electricity, computers, those kinds of things. So if you're like the sort of prepper that thinks we're going to be experiencing, complete civilizational meltdown, you might not think this is a good option.
Yeah. And so this is, again, what I would say. I say this to people all the time. Again, it's threat models and it's timing. Yeah. So what I'm and nobody I know is advocating launch into Bitcoin with 100% of your belongings. That makes no sense. For the average person, that makes no sense. For 99% of people, that makes no sense. But what I say to people, I have people who ask me, so what percentage should I buy in Bitcoin? And the only thing that I'm willing to say is a non-zero percentage. Because so much of it depends on your situation.
Yeah,
if you're somebody who's, if you're near retirement and you've got multiple properties and you've got some real estate, you've got some land, you've got some different things, then my answer to you is going to look different than it's going to look like to like a 23-year-old who's got a job, who's living with his parents and has, it's just going to look different.
Right.
So again, there's no one size fits all.
Right.
Answer.
And you can buy Bitcoin in very small amounts. So let's talk about Bitcoin. So Bitcoin, is like mentally this idea of a coin comes to mind.
Correct. Yeah.
And we don't think of coins as something that we can break into smaller bits unless you've got the equipment to actually do that and want to do that. So how do you get the smaller amounts? So we talked about sats and all that.
So sats is short for satoshis, which is, again, there's actually still a disagreement and like a debate within the Bitcoin community of what we should call these fractions.
Right.
So basically one Bitcoin can be divided up into 100 million fragments. So this is why. So if you're sitting there and we started talking about 21 million Bitcoin, and maybe there's some studious, well-read person in our audience, because that's all your audience is, I'm sure. You have some of them, and they've read a recent study, and they said, wait a second, there are 60 million millionaires in the world, and you're telling me there's only 21 million Bitcoin. That's not even enough Bitcoin for every millionaire to have one. And so my answer to you would be yes, that's why you should own some of it right now before those guys wise up. And then the other thing that I would say is, again, you can buy $1 worth of Bitcoin.
Yeah.
There's no reason that you have to buy a full Bitcoin. Maybe you wouldn't be surprised, but many people who I run into believe that, they see one Bitcoin's price at $66,000 today, and they think, I don't have $66,000. So they think that they can't buy Bitcoin because they can't buy a whole one.
Yeah.
The vast majority of people I know do not buy. Very few people I know buy whole Bitcoins. They're buying $100 here, $50 here. They might buy $50 a month or something.
Yeah. It lends itself very well to dollar cost averaging, so to speak. Yep. So one of the problems with, say, precious metals is that they're hard to do that with, and you've got salesmen who are always discouraging you from trying. They're always trying to talk you into you got to buy a coin, and then we're talking about, say, gold, an ounce of gold, you're talking at this point, over $2,000.
Yeah.
So, then people get into silver, but even then, it's just the dollar cost averaging approach is discouraged by the brokers. Yep. Another thing to think about is the fact that precious metals tend to be confiscated during times of economic crisis. In the United States, that occurred. That's something that maybe a lot of folks don't realize. Yeah.
So Executive Order 6102. It was FDR.
This is something that every Bitcoiner knows.
Oh yeah, we quoted. I got my tattoo. No, I'm just kidding. But yeah, it's one of these things where, again, so one of the things you find when you get, so the thing that I found in 5 years of being in the Bitcoin community is like these people, they become history buffs.
That's right.
They become, philosophy buffs.
Right.
Because they start to realize, man, there's so much more to this than I anticipated. And most of us have never taken classes on monetary theory or history or any of these things.
Right.
And so all of us are just realizing, man, there's a wealth of knowledge here that we weren't even aware existed.
Right.
So
Yeah. And transaction costs, there are transaction costs, but they're fairly modest.
Yeah, and so some of this comes down to there's people who object to, they're like, well, Bitcoin transactions still aren't free, and it's like, well, yeah, because like everything in life has a cost,
right?
Like the fact that anything you do has a cost of energy. In order for us to do anything, we have to pay a cost of energy.
Right.
If you try to avoid paying that cost and try to get something for nothing,
Usually that's a scam.
Yes, correct.
Well, and try exchanging currency.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And anytime you exchange currency, you lose.
Yes.
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
And sometimes you lose worse than others.
There's always a fee when you exchange currency.
And if you
it's what you're doing here.
Yeah.
You're exchanging currency.
Exactly. And I would say in my experience, again, Americans have had for 100 years the benefit of being the holders, and we only think in one currency, and it's the world reserve currency. That has been a benefit for us for 100 years.
Yeah.
For now, exactly. It's been a benefit for us for 100 years. But the blessing becomes a curse when you start to get to the end of some of these, the currency cycles, where you have the rest of the world who's used to thinking in multiple currencies.
Right.
And so they're used to realizing, wait, so the dollar actually has a cost associated with it too.
Right.
The dollar is just another good that can, it has a price associated with it, measured in other things. And so it's really hard for Americans to wrap their head around the fact that the dollar has a cost to it too. It's a really weird thing to.
And why is it the world reserve currency? Well, there may be some other things that people aren't willing to consider it that contribute to that.
Yeah.
So one of those is the biggest military in the world.
Oh yeah.
So we can force people to do things they don't want to do, but that won't always be the case.
Well, we can add one of the more interesting ones is the petrodollar.
Yeah, that's right.
Which is something that was negotiated by Nixon and thrown away by Biden.
Yep.
Right.
The petrodollar is what has enabled the U.S. to deficit spend so much.
Yeah.
Because everybody in the world needed dollars to buy oil.
Right.
The Biden there's a lot of U.S. foreign policy and a lot of unsavory things that we've done to preserve the petrodollar.
Correct.
Yeah.
Two good examples. Muammar Gaddafi decided to try to sell oil in a new gold coin that he was going to develop and skipped the dollar. And shortly thereafter, we basically engineered his death.
Right.
Saddam Hussein was going to sell oil to Europe in euros. And suddenly we have the Iraq War, and Saddam Hussein is dragged out of a hole and killed.
Right.
I mean, those are not accidental. There are other examples as well.
But I think that a lot of folks aren't just unaware of the petrodollar phenomenon.
Right.
Yep.
So the petrodollar was a deal that was worked out by Richard Nixon with Saudi Arabia, in which Saudi Arabia agreed that they would sell oil in dollars.
And only dollars.
And only dollars, and then the rest of the oil producers basically followed suit.
Right.
And there were other details involved with this. The Saudis would then invest those dollars in the U.S., and there was a whole series of things there. But when Biden froze Russian assets, it did a couple of things. First of all, it made countries say, wait a minute, we can't really trust the U.S. with our money. And secondly, it got Russia selling oil in something other than dollars, and Saudi Arabia then broke the petrodollar agreement, which means it's going to be much more difficult for us to finance our debt, which means lots of very bad things.
Yeah, surprise, you heard it first on the Theology Pugcast.
But this is a huge point.
Yeah.
So again, the petrodollar happened after the U.S. broke off the gold standard.
Right.
So what backed the dollar from 1944 until 1971 was the fact that there was a fixed amount. They had a peg. They pegged basically. So you had in 1944 you had the end of World War II. basically there were many countries in Europe that in order to survive,
they were dependent upon us. Yeah.
Exactly. They spent the majority of their gold reserves to countries like the United States, and in my case that I found, Uruguay. Yeah. Uruguay's economic heyday was during World War II. They sent canned meat all over the European theater. And so a lot of the buildings that were, a lot of the homes that still were built in Uruguay today were built in the 50s. Yes. So you have this example where in the aftermath, Europe doesn't have a lot of gold. Mm-hmm. So the question is, what are we going to use as a reserve currency? Yeah. So the United States, imagine there was a 900-pound gorilla in the room with us right now. Right. We can all express our opinions, right, but the 900-pound gorilla is going to be, sure. Like what he wants done is going to be done.
Yeah, the accidental superpower argument, which is, I think, a sound one, is basically all of our competitors just destroyed themselves.
Yeah, and so basically the United States, they said, hey, we have an idea of what currency to use in the aftermath of World War II. How about we do this? We've got a ton of gold anyhow. Right. So we'll peg the dollar to a certain ratio of gold. I can't remember if it's $25 or $35 per.
I think it's 35.
32 per ounce.
Okay,
32.
There we go. Okay. And so we'll do that. And then what we'll do is you guys either, I can't remember how this works. Like you guys can buy dollar reserves from us. You'll hold dollar reserves in your vaults rather than gold. And then we pinky promise that we won't create more dollars to break that peg.
Yeah.
Okay, as the only people who can legally print the world reserve currency, we pinky promise, pinky swear, we won't do that. And so this is what they do. And so from 1944 to 1971, this is the agreement. And the check on the system was the United States said, hey, anytime you want to, you can basically ask us and we'll give you gold for your dollar reserves. So what happened in 1971, it's called the Nixon shock, was basically, I believe it was France, came to the United States, it's either France or Germany. They came to the United States and basically said, hey, we want to exchange some of our dollar reserves for gold. The very next day, Nixon comes out and basically says, we're stopping the convertibility of dollars for gold. And basically what happens is everyone realizes that, the United States had been abusing this. It was called the exorbitant privilege. To be able to print the world reserve currency, they've been abusing this to basically benefit themselves. I'm sure there's some monetary historians somewhere who would be like, American monetary historians who would say, well, we had to fight the Cold War. Yeah. This was to protect ourselves against the Russians or to fund the space race or whatever it was. Right. But the point is they abused it. And so that peg was broken. And now every currency in the world was only as valuable as its government was fiscally responsible. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so you basically had this, if you imagine, all these national fiat currencies were like a kite, mm-hmm, and the U.S. dollar was a kite string, and the guy in the ground is gold. Mm-hmm. When that thing was cut, now everybody's just free floating, backed by nothing scarce, until the United States stepped in with the petrodollar. And so now you had effectively the dollar backed by gold, and the stranglehold that the world, basically the fact that all over the world there's huge demand for oil.
Right. Well, let's think a little bit about the fact that countries do things that are unethical.
Yep.
And you can find yourself in a situation where, as a man or woman of principle, you're dependent upon these powers.
Yep.
There's a problem that you face, and that's just basically how am I going to stay true to my convictions, yep, and still survive, yep, that kind of thing. And this is not a kind of thought experiment. This, yep, is something that happens every once in a while. So. Last year, when I was reflecting on kind of the character of Bitcoin, I knew that there are a lot of people who are uncomfortable with it because it, is something that criminals can use to, yep, pursue their own interests.
Oh yeah.
But it's also something that people who are virtuous can use to pursue their interests, yep, when the government is criminal.
Correct.
So the illustration I used, if you recall, last year was Casablanca.
Yep. Yeah.
So what you have in Casablanca, if you haven't seen the film Casablanca, what's the matter with you people? But anyway.
Turn off the podcast, get the film, watch it, right, then come back.
That's right. So in the very opening of it, you have a situation where you have refugees from all over Europe trying to get out of Europe because of the Nazis and the advance of the Nazi war machine, and they're fleeing to Casablanca because that's kind of like a place where refugees can go and have a little bit of time that they need to get their paperwork together, and they all want to come to the New World. That's the kind of the dream. But what you have then is a situation where you've got a lot of people who are very desperate and they don't have fungible assets. And the opening scene of the film is where you have in Rick's Cafe all of these people who have brought their most valuable possessions, diamond necklaces, etc. And then you have all these sharks who are saying, there are so many diamonds in Casablanca right now. I will give you, and so they're getting great deals on this kind of stuff. And I thought, as I was watching that film for the 10th time, I thought, man, Bitcoin would have been great to have in that situation. So yes, Bitcoin can be used by bad guys, but Bitcoin can also be used by really, really good guys. And in Christian missions, Bitcoin is a tool.
Yeah. So this is again one of the things where when I plead with Americans, and especially so when I talk about Bitcoin to people who are missionaries, they are much more. They grok the value proposition.
The grok. Okay, explain grok. That's
so I am not. So I don't know what it actually stands for, like where it came from. But it basically means to understand.
Heinlein.
Do you?
Yeah, it comes from Heinlein. Yeah.
Okay, there you go.
It's science fiction.
But so basically they appreciate the value proposition of Bitcoin much more readily than your average American Christian would. And so here's an example. So one of the limiting factors for missionaries moving funds around the world, moving money around the world, is the fact that due to foreign policy intervention, the United States has an ever increasing number of countries that are sanctioned. And so that means that they are cut off from the SWIFT system. They can't send dollars to them. So I have an acquaintance who lives in a country that I won't name, in a region of the world that is currently being sanctioned. His missionary organization can't send dollars, but they can send Bitcoin. And so what they do is they buy Bitcoin and they send him the Bitcoin. It gets there very quickly, final settlement right there. And then he turns around and has a peer-to-peer messaging app, like a Signal or a Telegram with a couple hundred people in it, that at any given point, there's people who are looking to either buy or sell Bitcoin. And he basically gets all his ducks in a row. His currency, the local currency, is hyperinflating. So he gets all his ducks in a row, gets all of his bills together, and then in one day goes and exchanges the Bitcoin for local currency and immediately goes and buys food and pays all of his bills as quickly as he can before the price of them increases. And so basically, this is one usage for Bitcoin that has nothing to do. You don't have to be convinced about the future performance of Bitcoin. It's purely as a medium of exchange vehicle, moving money across the world today.
So here's a thought or a question. Some people might say, well, I mean, if there are sanctions, how does Bitcoin get through that if the dollar can't get through it?
Correct. And so the way that it can do it is the same way that even in North Korea and other places like that, it's very difficult in North Korea, but most countries on the world that aren't absolutely draconian, you can still use things like Tor to access the internet. You can, encryption. You can leverage encryption as a tool to get access to things like the internet. So Bitcoin is just open source software. That there's no proprietary thing. It was just released on the internet. And so anybody with a very small quantity of memory and hard drive space can run this. And so there's really no way. Really no way. They literally have to go door to door in every country on earth to basically exterminate and wipe out everyone from guarantee that nobody was using Bitcoin.
Yeah. Well, in a place like North Korea, that might be conceivable, but in the vast majority of the world where people, are wanting to tie into the larger global economy, they have access to these things.
Yeah, the difficulty would be a place like Sierra Leone, which is where my son-in-law comes from, where they basically don't have electricity. They don't have stoplights in the entire country of Sierra Leone because they do not have anything like consistent electricity.
Correct. Yep.
So places like that would be the problem.
Yeah, exactly. So Bitcoin again, that's the thing is no, I'm not saying Bitcoin is a panacea at all. So today, 4 billion out of the 8 billion people on Earth have, I believe, have internet. I think there's some more than that have electricity, but they have internet. And so today, there's only half the world for whom Bitcoin is actually a viable thing today.
Actually, they're thinking about it. If you can do it through a phone, you can do it in Sierra Leone.
Yeah.
They don't have consistent electricity.
Correct. And so if you have a battery...
Even with that, with a phone, you could probably pull it off.
So one of the countries that has the highest percentage of Bitcoin adoption is Nigeria. So it skews very young, and it skews very technologically adept, and like there's lots of like phones. You can easily send Bitcoin transactions with phones, and there's a number of companies that are working to help.
Well, that's fascinating. Another place I understand where you have a lot of Bitcoin activity is China, which has tried repeatedly to shut it down.
Yes, I mentioned this in the talk. I would love to hear. So China has banned Bitcoin 7 times. And so
you only try to do it 7 times if 6 times it didn't work.
So again, it's one thing. It's in one sense, it's similar to marijuana legislation in the United States. Like still to this day, it still is illegal on the federal books. And yet, again, it's not technically nullification, but you just have people in states that are ignoring these federal laws to do what they want. And so part of the difficulty is because enforcement of these laws, you can make any law you want to. Just like as a parent, I can make any law that I want to for my kids, but then I have to come behind and enforce that. And the enforceability of a Bitcoin ban is increasingly impossible, even for an oppressive regime like China, which has blanket wall-to-wall surveillance of all kinds of stuff.
Right. Closer to home, it's my understanding that the Canadian truckers were helped by Bitcoin.
So, exactly. So I had the privilege. I do not take what the kids would call selfies at all, like very much. But we at the Bitcoin conference last year, there's a big Bitcoin conference and there's our tiny little one. So we do ours the 2 days before the big one. So I got to meet BJ Dichter, who was the spokesperson for the Canadian trucker protest. He basically said, they did a couple crowdfund things. We raised millions of dollars. People from within Canada, people within the United States sent us millions of dollars. But the Justin Trudeau and the Canadian government declared us enemies of the state, and basically they shut down our bank accounts. They co-opted our funds, and so basically we weren't able to access those funds for months. He's like, the exception to this was the $900,000 in Bitcoin that people donated. You can custody Bitcoin in such a way that that basically the government can't access it. But if you know what you're doing, and thankfully some of the leaders of the Canadian trucker protests were like hardcore Bitcoiners and knew how to custody it in such a way that the government wasn't able to get it, and they were able to distribute that money. And so you have not just this theoretical usage of Bitcoin. It was a cold, hard and fast proof of like this demonstrating this is actually possible. It's pretty easy to do. And so again, I said to BJ when I was interviewing him, I said, now again, I'm not gonna claim all the credit for this, but I will say I had literally been praying for something like an event like that to be able to demonstrate what Bitcoin could do, and this served as like a perfect test case that Bitcoin passed with flying colors.
Now let me just sort of play this out a little bit to maybe help illustrate why Bitcoin is so difficult to stop. So we have encryption, and with encryption, you've got to have, you're dealing with not just numbers, and not just big numbers, but incredibly big numbers. Mind-boggling big numbers. And so guessing a correct Bitcoin address or whatever you want to use, whatever the correct term is like trying to identify an atom.
In the universe.
In the universe.
and so that's based on the encryption standard that's used for Bitcoin right now, which is again the same encryption standard that's guarding the nuclear codes. So it's very difficult to do. It's impossible to guess.
Talk to me a little bit about rival cryptos.
So this is again a non-intuitive conversation. So when a lot of people, it depends on the framework that you're using to think about these things. So when a lot of people get into cryptos, they see that literally tens of thousands, I think there's like 20,000 cryptocurrencies. And the thing when they look at them, they start to think, okay, this is like stocks, So Bitcoin is like the Tesla of cryptocurrencies. And then you have Ethereum, which is like the Apple or something. And so that treats it's using stocks as a framework for them, which is not a very helpful thing when you like Bitcoin or they're currencies. And so currencies, they trend to one. Because basically it's very inefficient to use more than one currency. Nobody chooses to use more than one currency. If you can just use one, it's more efficient time-wise, fees-wise, all these things. And so that's the first thing is currencies trend to using one, which again, and this is one of the benefits again of being an American. We don't have to spend the brain power even if we're just calculating it by that to interact between, am I getting a good exchange rate today or should I wait till tomorrow? It just requires a lot more resources to do. The other thing is that Bitcoin operates very differently than again 99.9% of these cryptocurrencies. So, as an example, Bitcoin was created in 2000. The first Bitcoin was mined in 2009. Now, again, I will simply observe and describe the fact that the Bitcoin white paper was released to the world on October 31st, 2008, Reformation Day. Okay, the day that Luther just saying, the first Bitcoin block was mined, that Satoshi Nakamoto referred to as the Genesis block, was mined on January 3rd, 2009. Again, just saying, January 3rd was the day that Luther was excommunicated from the Catholic. I'm not saying, I know, I'm totally joking, but I just found that interesting.
Kind of interesting.
It is interesting coincidence.
Yeah. Maybe we're talking about Japanese Lutheran.
Exactly.
Is he even Japanese?
I would love to see the Venn diagram of Japanese Lutherans. I'm sure they exist.
But you do think he's actually Japanese, or
I have no idea. It could totally be again.
He could be throwing us off. It's just
100%. No idea, and I wouldn't even want to speculate. But so basically, Bitcoin existed for 2 full years before it ever was used to pay for anything. So before it ever monetized, it was just Bitcoin. You could mine it, you could trade it to somebody, you could give it to somebody, whatever. But it was never used in a transaction for some other good. So
the only people that would be into something like that would be like gamers.
Correct. Or again, I would say this lovingly, nerds. Like this is all. So again, the cryptography that formed the basis for Bitcoin was initially a weapon. It was used in World War II. There's always been code makers, code breakers. And so the first cryptographers, again, they were using this technology to try to protect themselves within war and to encrypt messages. And then this group of early computer enthusiasts called the cypherpunks tried to use this technology to provide things like privacy of information, of all these things. And so then the white whale for a long time for these cypherpunks had been, how do we apply this to money? And how do we to protect not just our data, but also protect our monetary units? So basically Bitcoin, it took 2 full years for someone to either think or actually execute, that we know of, at least publicly, to trade Bitcoin for some other good. Unless you want to you got to have use electricity or something.
You got to have a large enough community in order to make transactions feasible.
And so the first occasion, it's this famous thing, this guy named Laszlo said, I will give, basically, who will accept Bitcoin in exchange, who will give me 2 pizzas in exchange for Bitcoin? And so finally he found somebody who said, hey, if you give me 10,000 Bitcoin, I'll give you 2 pizzas. And so Bitcoin it had no value, no value at that point. And so this person was like, okay, I'll do it. And so Laszlo goes down in history. They celebrate it to this day. It's called Bitcoin Pizza Day. I don't remember the date. But they remember the day that this guy did the first Bitcoin transaction.
So 10,000 Bitcoin.
Which today is something like $600 million.
66 million.
That's crazy.
But so what happened then? So up to that point, Bitcoin was the only cryptocurrency that existed. And then as soon as this transaction happened, and people realized, wait a second, you mean to tell me that I can create my own cryptocurrency and basically become my own central bank?
Yeah.
They realized, wait a second, I am the money printer now. They realized that. And so that's when all of these other cryptocurrencies started spinning up. And so unlike Bitcoin, which is decentralized and doesn't have like a guy with the button to basically create more Bitcoin or whatever, a lot of these other cryptocurrencies, the way that they came to be was you had a small team of developers who basically said, all right, we're going to create, for example, 1 billion currency units. We'll give ourselves, each of the 3 of us, 200 million. Then we will find some celebrity or a couple celebrities. We'll give them a couple $100 million, and then we'll start selling some of these other ones. We'll put them on the open market.
Right.
And so the celebrity will say, this is the new big thing, the Kanye coin or something.
Right.
It'll be the next big thing. People start buying it because they're just thinking, okay, if Kanye thinks it's good, then I'll buy it. And then the early adopters will start dumping. They'll start selling a percentage of theirs, and then monetizing that.
Right.
So they turn these, currency units that they created out of thin air and exchange them for real dollars, value that was put into the system, injected into the system by normal people who don't know better.
So what is your hope for the conference, for your own work? What are you shooting for?
Yeah, so honestly, again, I could answer this. So I had the privilege to interview Doug Wilson about, I guess, 2 years ago. And I sat down with him, and I among other things, we talked about David Bahnsen. This will be a shock to David Bahnsen because David Bahnsen is not a Bitcoin enthusiast. I love a lot of what David Bahnsen does. And so a lot of the questions that I asked Doug had to do with some of his sit-down interviews with David. And so then I said to him, for the last 15 minutes, we only mentioned Bitcoin for the last quarter of the podcast. It was everything I do. It was everything I could do to withdraw myself or
restrain yourself.
Restrain, that's the word. Restrain myself. So for the last 15 minutes, I said to him, I was like, Pastor Wilson, I've been thinking about you guys as one example that embodies a lot of other Christians in the world for like 4 years in terms of Bitcoin. And the example that I gave him was this. So we live in a world in which open articulation of a policy as insane as, or of a belief as insane as a boy can't become a girl by simply cutting off his genitals, could render you canceled from your job, could render you potentially, theoretically, debanked.
Right.
And so I guess the question that I asked him was like, basically, if that were to happen tomorrow, I'm not saying based on fear or conjecture, this isn't some far off world, but if you were to if Christ Kirk was to get cut off tomorrow, how would you pay your staff? How would you pay your missionaries? These different things. Right. Over the long term, you're going to win because, by and large, the courts have been a bastion of sanity. Over the course of, it might take a year, might take a couple of years, might take 6 months, whatever. You're probably going to win. But in the meantime, your funds are locked up. Right. Now, in Moscow's case, they have friends all over they're going to be fine. Right. But the small church, who maybe has something similar happen to them, again, probably the church is going to rally. They're going to find out about it and try to help them. But this is a real issue in the world we live in. Yeah. And so Bitcoin presents the opportunity to hold money outside of this system to be used for any number of things. Right. And so, again, this is what I said to him, was like, basically, hey, this is an opportunity that, this is one tool in the tool belt for that, in my mind, is a measure of faithfulness at this point to take seriously these entities, these political entities. They're telling you who they are, and to not believe them at this point just isn't wise. It's not wise as serpents and innocent as doves. And so I look at Bitcoin as one tool in the tool belt that Christian organizations, that all these things really need to take seriously with at least a small percentage of what they're what they have. Even just, again, for an event like that. And then, again, we're going to be talking about this tomorrow. There is another conversation to be had as far as Bitcoin as like putting aside a percentage of your, whether it's corporate treasury if you're a business, or if you have an endowment or something like that, putting a percentage of that into Bitcoin as a way to take seriously the money printing and the the currency devaluation that we're seeing. As of this year, we mentioned this. By the end of this year, the interest on the U.S. debt will surpass the entire defense budget. And it's a not insignificant amount of money that we spend on defense. Yeah. And so I look at that and I see this. I saw in Uruguay what happens when currencies fails and the effects that it has on churches, nonprofit organizations, all these things. Right. And so the reality, so if you're a for-profit institution, and you experience hyperinflation or whatever, in the short term, you can adapt by increasing your prices. Right. But if you're a nonprofit organization like a church, Christian school, or a Christian university, what recourse do you have? Yeah, not much. You can go to your existing donor base and try to raise more money from them, or spend resources that you already don't have to go try to raise new funds. that's a possibility, but it's getting increasingly difficult. My alma mater, I graduated from Baptist, what was then called Baptist Bible College in Clark Summit, Pennsylvania, just closed 2 weeks ago because they couldn't make the economics work in the existing world we live in. And every week that goes by, I see more and more colleges. Was it Eastern Nazarene? What was it?
Yeah, I wrote about that for World Magazine.
Yeah. So this is something that's happened. More and more Christian schools are closing, more and more colleges. And some of them, this is sad to say, but some of them need to go.
Yeah.
Some of them it's just due to, they've gone liberal theologically and a bunch of other things. But there are good people doing good work that are still trying to reconcile with how do I live, economically, financially in this world where there's so much money created that devalues the value of all the money, the rest of the money that exists in the economy.
So if you are just brand new to all this and you want to dip a toe into it, what would you advise a listener to do?
Dip a toe into trying to understand Bitcoin?
Well, not that. Actually, getting some.
Yeah. So again, basically, I would go to a Bitcoin exchange. Okay. So just like there's exchanges for stocks, or there's exchanges for anything, there's exchanges that sell Bitcoin. Probably many, if you have listeners who are familiar with Bitcoin at all, you've probably heard of Coinbase. It's like one of the most well-known ones. Basically, I would not recommend them. And one of the reasons is this. So Coinbase, their business model, they sell thousands of cryptocurrencies. Now, is that because they actually believe that those are valuable and have some kind of future? No. The reason why they're willing to sell thousands of cryptocurrencies that, and I will say they actually know are worthless, is because they make 1.5% to 2% anytime you either buy or sell.
Right.
They're making money on both sides of that trade. And so if all they care about is making money right now, and they don't care, consequences be damned, they're willing to do that. They're making tons of money. On the other hand, there are a handful of Bitcoin exchanges that only sell Bitcoin. Mm-hmm. Now, you might think they're idiots. You might think that's a foolish thing. But what I always tell people is you can't think that they're crooked for doing that. Because in the meantime, in the short term, they're leaving millions of dollars on the table by not selling these other things. Mm-hmm. And so you could basically argue they're not as crooked as they could be.
So could you name a couple?
Yeah. So one of the ones, we basically work with a couple of them. We have referral or affiliate links. So we don't even have to use those. But there's one called river.com. Only sells Bitcoin, have great people work for them. I know people personally work for them. There's another one called Swan Bitcoin. Again, same thing. They only sell Bitcoin. And in both of those cases, they will, as much as you're interested in it, they will basically educate you of what this is, how to take custody of your own Bitcoin if you so desire, basically how to hold Bitcoin yourself in such a way that it can't be
they could hold it for you, or you could hold it for yourself.
If you're just getting it and you're like, I have no idea what I'm doing, they're not going to force you to do it, but they want to help you understand what Bitcoin was designed to be. So if you were
going to hold it for yourself, how does that work? I've heard of a wallet.
Yes.
How does that work?
Yeah. So basically, a wallet works just like a physical wallet. It's just a way for you to custody Bitcoin, and there's a number of different options. There are what are called hot wallets, which is basically a wallet that's connected to the internet. So an application on your cell phone could be an example of that. And there's different types of those. But basically,
so it sounds like probably the level of your, I guess, suspicion or maybe fear or
paranoia.
That's the word I'm looking for. The level of your paranoia will determine what's the best.
Correct.
So then you don't want a hot wallet if you're
mega paranoid. Then you
want a thumb drive and you want to lock it someplace where you don't lose it.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah.
Because if you lose it,
it's gone.
It's gone.
Correct. Yeah. That's so. Bitcoin requires a level of responsibility that we are very unacquainted with in the modern age.
Right.
So now again, there are ways, there's recourses. So one of the most tinfoil hat ways of doing this, the most secure ways, is there's people who they stamp their seed phrases on, they have stamp it into steel that's this thick, and then they stick it in a vault. And these things are fireproof. So even if your house burns down, you will still have your seed phrases and can still access your Bitcoin. Gotcha. So there's varying levels of threat models that you can overcome with different tools that are out there.
Right. Well, is there anything you want to kind of leave with? We're getting to the point we should wrap things up.
Makes sense.
Something that you want to just say, if you don't think of anything else, remember this.
Yeah. We wrote the company too. So TGFB Media started first as the book. So again, the book is called Thank God for Bitcoin. We wrote it. I think it's like the paperback is like $12 on Amazon. Again, we wrote it. It's called Thank God for Bitcoin, the creation, corruption, and redemption of money. We really only talk about Bitcoin in the last 2 chapters. It's very similar if some of your readers have read Gary North's book, Honest Money. Okay. It's like a 9th grade reading level, beginner's level intro to just the ethics of money production. And then we talk about Bitcoin and a little bit and what makes it different. We actually reached out to Gary North. He went to be with the Lord, obviously, like last year or something. Right. We reached out to him when we published the book and asked him if he would write a foreword for us. And he was like mortified. He was like, I do not like Bitcoin. And so somebody asked me last year, like, did Gary North, like, was he into Bitcoin? And I always jokingly say, he is now. He gets it now. He's But yeah, so that would be one place. The company is tgfb.com. You can find out more information. We're a small outfit. We don't have a ton of resources. I host a couple podcasts where I mainly, at this point, interview people who are within the Bitcoin space. There's another fantastic podcast. If you're looking to, understand more of the nuts and bolts, I think it's called the Bitcoin and the Bible podcast.
I think I've heard of that.
Yeah. It's got 26 episodes. Right. Tom Askell actually interviewed one of the guys who's speaking, and he mentioned that it's a great resource. Yeah. So that'd be another thing I would recommend. And then we've got a couple of other books in the works right now. We've got a kid's book coming out called The Orange Umbrella. Hopefully by next spring it'll be out.
Oh, fun. Well, great stuff. Well, we should wrap things up. We really appreciate your, spending some time with us and talking about this stuff. Is there anything you want to say, Glenn, as we wrap up?
Yeah. I first ran into Bitcoin probably shortly after it started being used.
Yeah.
A photojournalist, former Green Beret named Michael Yohn, basically raises funds to do what he does through donations, and he started accepting Bitcoin. Okay. And I thought, that sounds interesting. I should look into that. And of course I didn't.
That's right. That's one of those missed opportunities. Yeah.
I will say, I said this when we sat down, but I don't listen to a ton of podcasts. Your podcast is one of my absolute favorite podcasts. So I feel like I stepped through the back of the wardrobe into Narnia, like being here.
Well, that's fun to hear. We appreciate that. Well, thank you, Jordan. It's been great to have you on the show.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah, and I do own Bitcoin, I just so everybody knows.
All right, there we go.
All right. Thanks a lot for listening to this episode of the Theology Pugcast. Speaking of accepting Bitcoin, maybe that's something we should set up.
Yep, let's do it.
And we'll use you as our consultant.
Happy to.
But if you'd like to support us conventionally with dollars, you can do that through Patreon. And we have a link in the show notes to our Patreon page. And there are a number of things there that you'll see that I think are pretty self-explanatory. So check it out. And we appreciate all the folks who do support us on an ongoing basis. Well, that's enough for now. Thanks a lot. And bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
The Theology Pugcast is a ministry of Trinity Reformed Church in Huntsville, Alabama. To learn more about the church, you can visit trinityreformedkirk.com. trinityreformedkirk.com.